It's interesting that Richard Carrier just kind of reverses the thing and says, look, you got to account for the appearances of Jesus to the disciples, so now we'll posit an empty tomb.
Right, they'll make up the empty tomb to try to account for it. Well, you know what? I think the evidence is strong that the tomb was empty, especially when you have the critics of Jesus conceding it was empty.
Yeah, explain that.
Yeah, I mean, they try to come up with an explanation to explain why it was empty, which presupposes that there wasn't a body in it. And they said, well, the disciples stole the body while the guards were asleep. Well, nobody believed it back then, and nobody believes it today. It's a ridiculous explanation. But it's conceding that the tomb was really empty. I think the evidence is clear. And this idea that the body was relocated, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me that Mary doesn't pull aside these guys before they're put to death and say, you know what, this is all a mistake, it's all a misunderstanding. The body's 2 blocks to the south.
Yeah, I'll give you another one that showed up on Stone Phillips on Dateline, and it was with Tabor. And Tabor not only said that the body was moved, but he knows where it was moved to.
Yeah, this is what kills me. Now, I got to give him his due. Tabor is a respected historian. I'm not making fun of him. But, having said that, in his book, The Jesus Dynasty, he says, I think I know where the body's buried. Really? Where? And he gives a location. Well, that's interesting. Where did you find that out? Well, turns out it's a 16th century Jewish mystic and Kabbalist who had a vision that told it. And I remember Craig Evans said, well, if you're going to believe a vision of a 16th century Jewish mystic, why don't you believe the account of the Apostle Paul right there in the first century of this very concrete experience he had with the resurrected Jesus? You talk about picking and choosing what you want to believe. It just does not make sense. But, John, this is what you get when you start with the bias and the presupposition that the supernatural is impossible. You have to come up with some crazy explanation for things. And that's why these minimal facts are so important. Because we can either feed our biases, as I think a lot of these historians do, and just go for the most bizarre explanations and feed their biases, or you can try to minimize your biases, because we all have biases. And what the minimal facts do is they level the playing field by saying, hey, these are facts that, we studied 2,200 sources written by critics of Christianity and believers in Christianity, scholarly reports on the resurrection going back 30 years, French, German, and English, and this is universal virtually, that they accept these facts. The empty tomb, 75% as opposed to virtual unanimity, but still, that's a huge percentage, vast majority. And so that's a way to factor out our biases. If people who are opponents of Christianity are even conceding that these facts are true,